Welcome to Coastal Conversations, a monthly program that deals with major issues confronting the nation's coastal areas, marine and Great Lakes. This program is made possible through the generosity of the Roddenberry Foundation. I'm Jerry Schubel with the Aquarium of the Pacific, and I'm your host. Today we're going to explore a recent report of the National Research Council entitled Enhancing the Value and Sustainability of Field Stations and Marine Laboratories in the 21st Century. I have today with me 4 members of the committee responsible for writing the report. They are Felicia Coleman from Florida State University's Coastal and Marine Laboratory, Peter Kariva, the Nature Conservancy, Rob Plows, the University of Texas Brackenridge Field Laboratory, Mary Power, the University of California, Berkeley, Angelo Coast Range Reserve. Welcome, colleagues. I should point out to our viewers that my 4 guests are in 4 different parts of the country, so orchestrating this conversation poses some challenge. Field stations and marine labs have been important components of the nation's and the world's research infrastructure for a long time, and many believe their importance will increase in the future because of climate change and the rapidity with which humans are altering the environment. But many are struggling financially. A number have been closed, and others are threatened with closure. Last year, the National Research Council completed a study at the request of the National Science Foundation to assess and make recommendations to field stations and marine labs to make them more resilient so they can continue to thrive in the 21st century. I had the privilege of working with the guests who are on this program on that study, and on the slide you can see the full list of the committee members. I want to pause just long enough so people can glance at that full membership. Felicia, I want to start with you. How do field stations and marine labs contribute to the nation's research infrastructure and the nation's research enterprise? Give us a few of the special and perhaps unique opportunities that they offer. After Felicia speaks, I'm going to ask Mary and Rob to add to her response, and also Peter.
You ready? Yeah, field stations are centers for research, conservation, education, and more recently, outreach. And they provide portals into viewing the natural world. For more than a century, and for probably more than 1,000 sites across the planet, generations of scientists have observed and documented the physical and chemical and biological changes across that landscape, and looking at things like how species interact with one another or respond to changes in rainfall or forest cover. And for those reasons, field stations are critical enterprises. And what we now know, and Jerry's pointed out, is a world that's changing quite rapidly as the human footprint grows, from problems with climate change and losses in biological diversity, fishing and pollution. All of these things pose considerable threats to ecosystems, to economic and human health. And field stations, whether they're sophisticated marine laboratories that are in urban settings, or they're postage stamps, almost gated reserves, part of a natural reserve, they provide places for conducting experiments and classes in a more or less protected and to some extent pristine environments. So they have enormous natural capital and intellectual capital that are serving the nation quite well.
Thank you very much. Mary, what would you add to what Felicia has just said?
I'll just continue with their theme. Field stations are among the only places where research can really sustain a long view of changes to natural lands and natural creatures, populations. And without a long view, sometimes decades of study, you really won't be able to understand how prairies, forests, rivers, coral reefs rocky intertidal zones, whatever ecosystem your heart is focused on, you won't understand how they work. And without understanding how they work, you can't predict how they'll respond to change, to some of those threats that Felicia mentioned. She named a bunch of threats that we're all aware of, but we don't really know what their consequences will be, how serious they are, maybe how to manage to make ecosystems more resilient against them. And the other thing is that you might ask why we can't just watch the landscapes and ecosystems change on protected lands like those conserved by the Nature Conservancy or in our national parks. Research field stations are crucial because often scientists need to do fairly large-scale experiments, at least fairly conspicuous experiments. It's often the very best pathway to real mechanistic understanding so that you have some ability to predict. And for those, you need these dedicated research field stations.
Thank you, Mary. Rob, what would you add to that?
Well, they've pretty much covered the high points there. Totally in agreement that as field stations, as living observatories of nature, they really do allow for not only place-based studies which are local and relevant to a local community or research environment, but they can also be scaled up and form part of a national network, observing things on a much larger basis and larger scale. So they have all these components of being able to scale up across time, short, brief experiments versus the long time ones necessary to study change, and from local versus continental scale questions.
And Peter, have we missed anything?
Yeah, I think you've kind of missed the most obvious thing about field stations, and that's that I bet you almost all of us on this call got interested in biology and science partly because of a field station experience. And I was going to be a lawyer until I went to Duke Marine Lab. Lucky for law, I went to Duke Marine Lab. But I think you can't overstate their value in inspiring young people to embark on a career in science. And it's not just in ecology and environmental science. They're pretty sophisticated now. And I bet if we kept better records, we'd find that an awful lot of the global leaders in the scientific enterprise had some contact with the field station.
All right, now I think with those four views we have pretty much covered it. So I think clearly field stations and marine labs have been an important part of the nation's research infrastructure, and they've played important roles in science, and their importance will only increase in the future. On the screen you can see some of the more than 900 of these facilities that exist around the world. So important, clearly. But many are vulnerable during changing economic times that we live in, and many believe that these times are going to be the new normal that we're going to have to deal with. So what are some of the recommendations that were made in the report to make field stations and marine labs more resilient to change so they can cope with the new normal? We're going to go round robin, one idea each, state it as briefly as you can, and this time I'm going to start with Peter. Peter?
So I think the first thing we could do with field stations is connect them to the business community. I think more and more businesses are engaged with the environment. Their employees want to be engaged with the environment. And I think the local enterprise has a lot to be gained by connecting to field stations, and the field stations have a lot to be gained by connecting with the local businesses.
Good. Rob?
So continuing with that theme, we talked about the need for field stations to have and to communicate what we call a value statement, which is some way of really identifying what their capacity is to contribute and to be able to communicate that to have people institutionally and otherwise and funding agencies understand their value, and as Peter says, into the business community as well. So having a very well-defined value statement would be a starting point and essential.
Felicia?
Well, it strikes me that One of the things that people care about more is doing science that matters. And I see that a lot in students. When we look at the metrics that marine labs and departments use for success, it's always things like how many grants you've gotten and how many publications you've had. But you know, the government's asking, what have you done for me lately? Where do we have successes in bridging those gaps between science and policy? And I think keeping track of those sorts of things is very important.
Mary, what would you add?
I think I just compliment what everybody else has touched on with talking about the grassroots importance of field stations. I really agree with connecting to business, and of course we have to connect to the institutions that are host institutions and sometimes remote from field stations. So those outward connections are important, but these local commitment to understanding the local environments and changes in them. Citizens, people who live in places, watersheds, sometimes are seeing accelerating changes that are of grave concern to them. Fire ants, invasive species, grasshopper plagues, and in our neck of the woods, it's toxic algal blooms in what used to be a salmon supporting river. And so they can be full of fear, they can be a little afraid of the entire river, everything green in it. But if they come to a field station where algae are being studied, get over their fear of microscopes, look down at, pretty soon you can't get the locals to break for beer because they're seeing so much beauty and so much interest, and starting to learn how the players fit together and how they may respond to changes like drought in California. This empowers local citizens, and it links directly to public health agency concerns, and then of course business community health of societies that they're going to try to connect with.
Have we missed anything? Would anyone of the four of you like to add anything to what's been said? No? Okay. Well, one of the things that particularly impressed me about experiences at field stations and marine labs is the coming together of scholars and students from different disciplines to spend time together, not for a lecture or a seminar, but for a weekend, a week, or even an entire field season. Eating together, working together, exploring ideas together, bringing together of the disciplines has recently been given the name convergence. And you see that word a lot now. And many field stations and marine labs have been doing it for decades, and in some cases for more than a century. Each of you comes from a field station or marine lab, and I'd like each of you to comment on the added potential these facilities have to expand and enrich opportunities for convergence, to be more inclusive of fields that have been less well represented. For example, the social sciences, the arts, and the humanities. This time we're going to start with you, Felicia.
Well, field stations historically have been places where scientists conduct science, and everybody knows that scientists are rational, analytical, logical people, but they're creative. They experience tremendous thrill with discovery and coming up with the experiments to try to understand the world is really a creative process. And but we think of artists as being creative, but part of what artists do also is involves research. It involves experimentation and developing hypotheses. So scientists and artists aren't really all that different. We've already been changing the way we do science by having it become more and more interdisciplinary, and that's tremendously expanded our ability to understand the world and to understand nature. We've sort of stepped on the threshold of involving the social science, whether it's natural resource economics or cultural studies of fishing and Native Indian communities. The field stations really can serve as a crucible for this sort of next experiment that's already started at a number of stations of combining art and science. One of the things that scientists are up against is parts of the national community that are afraid of science, don't understand it, and denigrate it, and we have to change that. And I can think of no better way than having a truly interdisciplinary, outside of the sciences, with humanities, the arts, that actually gets people connected in ways that we don't already do that. And field stations are perfect places for doing that because of the community nature that, Jerry, I believe you'd already mentioned something about it. It was one of the things that drew all of us to field stations in the first place.
Mary, what would you add to what Felicia has said?
Yeah, I pick up on Felicia's last comment and what Peter said about engaging young people, how we all probably got our starts in field stations. Imagine that you get to learn a skill of making field measurements, climbing 60-meter trees on ropes, and being next to a practicing scientist, and you learn these skills and get the confidence in the field. And then you go back and you make a meal together and you wash dishes together, and you're talking about why you're interested in a particular question, or how you do science, how you don't do science. And so this can let high school kids talk to senior researchers. All the ages get included, and the communication is much more than just dry science. It's a life philosophy and science and the love of why they're doing it. And then when you're even talking across practicing scientists, it's very hard to communicate across cultures, like environmental engineering to ecology is very hard. Different goals, different vocabularies. So field stations provide a period where they can live long enough away from all the distractions of their emails and their cell phones to really hammer out the concepts and the vocabulary and come to the convergence of the goals that will take us into a more functional science for the future.
Thank you, Rob. What would you add to that?
Well, it was well put. I like the way Mary expressed that field stations have a capacity to, attract groups, disparate groups from across disciplines. They can be out in the field, away from technology, having brainstorming work-type sessions where ideas can be generated. And so the challenge is to create those environments. They're not going to happen, and I don't know how many field stations already have these patterns of activity where these programs have to and you can kind of forcefully do it by setting up meetings and trying to draw people in. There are various models of how you could get this started, but there's certainly, when it happens well, and there's some really good examples. And I think of engineers and science coming together, green buildings and improvements to the energy efficiency and this type of thing. And field stations are good examples of where this has happened.
Peter, would you like to add to what has been said?
Yeah, well, Felicia, I'm not so sure scientists are always that rational and analytical, but I think the big thing that could be taken much better advantage of at field stations is what I call environmental humanities. I think we get ourselves in a lot of trouble as scientists because we don't listen to human values enough. And field stations would be terrific places to engage both science and the humanities in those types of discussions. I've been doing writing workshops for the Nature Conservancy for the last 10 years, and I always take the writers to field stations just because it's a cool place to have those discussions. And I would just like to see us embrace the humanities a lot more at these stations.
Good. You all made good points. One of the topics that we wrote about in the report is the way that we select leaders of field stations and marine labs, and how the criteria need to go to change as we move forward. I'd like to have each of you comment on this theme. In addition to scholarly credentials, do we need to put more emphasis on management and leadership and entrepreneurial skills? This time we're going to start with Mary. Mary?
Yes, I see the inward-looking and the outward-looking requirements that go way beyond what we've already talked about. Field stations are places, and on one hand, the directors especially the resident directors, need to have an intense commitment to those places. That means they are good stewards of the natural ecosystem, but they're very connected to the local human communities. They know their concerns. And then field stations are getting harder and harder to maintain because the technical infrastructure that's getting more sophisticated for, wireless networks to monitor environmental conditions all over thousands of acres, that requires a lot of care and feeding, and the demands of doing cutting edge environmental monitoring are huge, expensive, and requiring lots of effort and expertise. So that is an infrastructure that's only going to get more intense in the future. It's not going to get easier to manage. So there's all this inward looking need, and then maybe it'd be a miracle if this occurs in the same person, but you also need these outward networking people that others have mentioned. Field stations are much more powerful and effective and useful if they're networked so that problems can be addressed across broad geographic scales, and cool technologies and tricks can be shared. So you can, so that networking just among field stations is important, but the big science funding now is interdisciplinary, so that's often national or international in scale. And then just to maintain the enthusiasm at a home university campus or a home institution, that requires a lot of constant vigilance, constant effort. So just to maintain support for field stations that are often remote from those places. So you need the inward and outward looking either team or miraculously talented person to do that. I think Felicia can do both, but there aren't many others.
Rob, what would you add to that?
Yeah, so to that point, there are not a lot of people who have these skills across many disciplines, and so one solution would be to think of management teams where you're bringing together in a small, tighter user organization or user group, sort of a support team for that particular field station, but you still need a champion. You need somebody, as Mary says, to put across the values and defend the ideas and the potential for field stations. And all of this has got to be size scale. We've talked about how you get these really small field stations, which really don't have a lot of capacity or a lot of infrastructure need, through to the very large ones where you need all the communications and infrastructure support. So, scale it appropriately, but think of that it wouldn't have to just be one particular person. But if you're having that one person do it all, then cut them some slack in the sense of don't measure them on classical, and don't even hire them according to classical job descriptions and performance evaluations. They need to be measured according to what their expectations are for the field station demands.
Felicia, what would you add to those comments?
I think they've pretty much covered it. I mean, it's always a trade-off. You want a leader that is going to attract other people to the lab, and for that reason, they're always looking for good scientists to do that thing, do that job. But you can't do everything. I think, part of what Rob was saying was you have a management team. So maybe your associate director is a business person, somebody who really gets it, and they can work together to pull the science forward and be able to manage a complicated facility.
Peter, what would you add?
I think the field station, especially for the more major ones, their heads have to think of themselves differently. I think they should think of themselves as CEOs. They're a CEO of a complex enterprise, and yeah, they can't do it all, so they get a team to help them. But that's a very different identity than just a leading scholar and teacher.
Okay, thank you. One of the topics the report was quite strong on was the need for field labs and field stations and marine labs to be more nimble, more entrepreneurial, to have more diverse funding portfolios. And Peter, you and the Nature Conservancy have set a high bar in this regard. I'd like you to start by commenting on the need for field stations and marine labs to be more entrepreneurial.
So I think, Jerry, this follows up from my CEO statement. And what we've realized in conservation is you can't rely on just one source of funding and one constituency. Field stations are in a good place if they really pause to think about it. They have their education mission. They have their research mission. They're always embedded in a local community. They have a local community. Often they're associated with a place that has a natural legacy that people value. They have that as a brand. They have issues. If you're a marine lab, there's businesses and government agencies that care about marine issues. So if they think of themselves that way and they put together funding from all those constituencies, they'll do much better than just thinking of themselves as an academic department on a main campus, which is very, very different. They need to recognize how special they are and take advantage of it.
Who would like to add to Peter's comments? Anybody can chime in here.
Yes, it's Rob here, and I just wanted to add one point in terms of the funding and approach to that we talked about. And a lot of scientific funding is competitive, grant writing and such like. And so the alternative way is to become more collaborative, and through the networking that was really, it spells out in a lot of detail in the report. Through networking, you can collaborate with other field stations and potentially access funding sources at a much larger scale that from organizations and funding bodies that would maybe not want to fund something at 100,000, but would be lucky to fund something up at $1 million, and something which can be really scaled up and tackle the big questions we're talking about. So that was an opportunity that we identified and that we think should be pursued.
Mary or Felicia, would you like to add anything? No? Okay. I would just remind you, Peter Drucker, the management guru, said that leaders and managers do different things. Leaders are responsible for doing the right things, and managers are responsible for doing things right. And clearly you've got to have both leadership and management if you're going to thrive. Now we're at the point where I'm going to ask each of you if you would like to add a parting thought about the importance of field stations and marine labs in public outreach. We've talked a little bit about that, but who would like to start? Anybody is welcome to begin. Come on, public outreach. That's very important. Peter, start off. You said you commented on this earlier.
So one of the things that I think we could do much more, and I know it's in the report, and everybody on this call is engaged in it, is what I would call citizen science. Really engaging the public in collecting data and information that's relevant to what's going on at field stations. And the one experiment that we've done at the Conservancy that works good is crowdsourcing interpretation of satellite images, getting 100 pairs of eyes on every image. And it engages the public, it makes them part of science, and it actually contributes incredibly valuable data. Every field station should have some engagement with citizen science.
Okay, who else would like to add to this? Remember, we talked about the difference between public outreach and extension in this report.
So I'd like to just chip in here and just make a comment about outreach and why maybe some of the interface with the public has not been as effective as it should have been, and that is that often, and then we can look at that as a source of, how do we solve the problems? But the one issue is that a lot of people at field stations are driven by the educational and the research mandates, and so they're not being measured on how much outreach is being done. That needs to change. And the other is that a lot of often field stations have sensitive projects going on where you can't have a lot of public access, and we talked about that earlier. And so one has to be very careful about what type of outreach is tuned to the particular capacity of a particular field station. But having said that those are some constraints, we can find ways to overcome those, and we should do more to communicate the value to the public, yes.
One of the other topics in our report that we said we needed to focus more on is developing a set of metrics to measure, to demonstrate the importance and the contributions of field stations. Who would like to make a comment on that? And we're getting near the end of our time, but I think it's important to at least make a few comments about this.
I have one comment, but I think I already made it, and it kind of I wasn't sure whether to put it in the outreach component or in this component, but Peter brought up the fact that, you know, these field stations they're not departments, and there has to be a change in the upper administration and the way that they view field stations. And so, you know, while the metrics of the metrics of publications and grants is great, there have to be other kinds of metrics that the public cares about. I mean, one of the changes that we've seen, I think, in students is they want to do science that matters in both an ecological and a social framework. And what are the contributions of field stations to that sort of thing?
Would anyone else like to add to what Felicia has just said?
Jerry, I'm not sure. I think I might have lost my voice connection. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay. So I wanted to comment on the last step, the last comment that our previous director for the UC Natural Reserve System, which now has 39 reserves, was that these reserves should be places for protected research, but also stepping stones to the larger regions where they represent California and where we can learn about and engage with communities. And it's kind of like the Nature Conservancy's conservation by design rather than last best places. But what we can do as field stations that is very important is keep the science as an honest broker role. That when you engage in watershed issues, water limitation, water withdrawals, water diversions, for example, and there are many other examples, you get into politically charged controversies, and often the field stations can provide respected information that's used by both sides and can help in bringing both sides to reasonable compromises or solutions. So I think that's one larger important mission that we may serve more and more in the future as our world gets more overtaxed and more crowded.
Thank you, Mary. All right, we're going to go round robin. If each of you would like to make a closing comment on any topic that relates to the importance of field stations and marine labs and what we need to do to make sure we do not lose these important facilities. We'll do this in alphabetical order. So we're going to go, Felicia, you're going to go first.
Well, you know, one of the things that we haven't really talked about is the historical aspect of field stations. You know, if we want to think about a mobile field station, it's an example we used in the report. You can think of the HMS Beagle as a field station on which Darwin observed and recorded so much information that led to his work on natural selection and species change over time. There's a tremendous amount of information out there, black data. We've been talking about this for a while, that's buried in field stations, probably buried into departments. And there's got to be a way to pull that information out to move forward. But I think more, you know, the field stations have been receptacles for all of this information, and it just has tremendous value.
Peter Kariva.
So I think of field stations as a real national treasure, just like we think of our museums and our arts that way. And we need to speak about them more in that fashion. If you're a state and you don't have a single field station in that state, I would think you'd be embarrassed and feel like there was a real lacking there. So let's put them, up front as a real asset.
Rob?
Well, I think that we're faced with the challenge of communicating the value of field stations often. There are a lot of intangible, difficult things to measure that we can only really do by anecdote. There are serendipitous discoveries which occur at field stations that really lead to important contributions to society and technology. There are changes which occur to students coming through, the opportunities for STEM engagement at field stations. So many of these things are there, very, very important contributions, very hard to measure and to communicate, but we should emphasize that.
Mary?
My last thought, I think, would speak to the generational wisdom of field stations that's not only scientific but also cultural. We have now very well generously funded networks of kind of cut and dry, same methods applied in a network across the U.S., the National Environmental Observatory Network, for example, NEON. So you're getting these measurements, and you may have SWAT teams that go around in helicopters collecting snapshot databases of species lists, that sort of thing. Those are valuable, but they're not going to really provide the insight that an old field researcher can hand down to a young field researcher that has really lived with a system, or an old tribal member or local rancher who's been there for 3 generations can hand down to younger scientists. So this generational wisdom about how places work, what they were like a decade or 2 or 3 ago, it's just critically important, and it mustn't be overlooked as we ramp up these huge environmental monitoring networks to global scales. They both are incredibly complementary, and the field stations are a critical component of that.
Thank you. We're at the end of our time, and I want to thank my guests, Felicia Coleman, Peter Kariva, Rob Plows, and Mary Power, for joining me for this edition of Coastal Conversations. I also want to thank the Roddenberry Foundation for making Coastal Conversations possible. We hope that you will join us next month for the next edition of Coastal Conversations. I'm Jerry Schubel. To understand how a forest grows, or why and where a river flows, we must first go out and directly observe our environment. Field stations and marine labs connect scientists, educators, and communities to their environments by bringing the basic tools of science into the field. These living laboratories place scientists on the front lines of our changing Earth. But to fulfill their unique role, field stations must continue to evolve. By adopting new technologies, developing even stronger networks, and incorporating more entrepreneurial leadership, field stations can meet the challenges of a rapidly changing world. City, mountain, prairie, desert, forest, ice, or sea. All of these environments are home to field stations. Though they range in size and scope, field stations are windows into ecosystems that provide unique educational and research opportunities. Away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, field stations foster collaborations among scientists from different disciplines. Field stations provide hands-on, discovery-based learning for students of all ages. New tools, such as mobile apps, allow citizen scientists to collect data in unprecedented ways. But field stations are often overlooked for infrastructure upgrades and funding. We need to document the valuable roles field stations play in science and society with better metrics of their performance and impact. Long-term environmental data helps scientists to forecast change. More robust networks of field stations would make it easier to share these data and transform them into knowledge that aids decision-making. Imagine the potential of linking field stations to other organizations to pool data on the impacts of a regional drought, an extreme storm, or longer-term environmental changes resulting from human activities. Field stations have long been vital links to the environment through research, education, and community outreach. Harnessing their power and potential will help us better understand our shifting climate and ecosystems and create the knowledge we need to conserve the natural world.